What's up, guys? Welcome to Dissecting Gundam. Today we're going to be looking at the very first episode of Mobile Suit Gundam, which aired April 7th, 1979. Now, you might not think that there's a lot to discuss with the first episode, since it's really just an introduction to a lot of the main characters and this, overall story, but there are some really interesting literary tropes that are used here, as well as some differences between the subtitled and dubbed versions that I want to talk about. So let's hop in. Alright, so if you've ever seen any Gundam media, or any anime in general for that matter, you'll recognize that this is the sort of intro prologue piece that's repeated every episode. It reminds me a lot of the title page of American comic books, where, if you open up Spider-Man, there's a little blurb there that just says, hey, bitten by a radioactive spider, he has spider powers, now he's the amazing Spider-Man. It really is just to onboard the viewer to what they're about to watch so they can kind of get up to speed right away. Okay, so here we have the first sort of dramatic twist from the narrator, where he's talking about these space colonies, and he says where people are born and raised, then there's a dramatic pause, and where they died, and we get introduced to the Principality of Zeon. This is also an interesting difference between the translations of the subtitled and the dubbed versions, because in the dubbed version, he says where they die in the present tense, versus in the subtitled version, where it's they died. I don't know if this was an intentional, sort of localization, but this is one of those things where the meaning can kind of be interpreted to be something different. But I don't think that it's really worth diving into that much in this particular instance. This is another interesting setup in the prologue that warrants mentioning. Is nowhere in the prologue does it say that there are good guys and bad guys, even though we're going to learn as the story goes along that the Principality of Zeon are in fact the aggressors. The way that it's phrased is that the Principality of Zeon launches a war of independence against the Earth Federation. There's really not any kind of language to tilt it one way or the other. Zeon and the Federation forces caused the deaths of half the total population. Again, no blame is being assigned here, and humanity is horrified by their own actions. This is another one of those unique translations between the sub and the dub, is that in the dubbed version, the sentiment is they were horrified by the atrocities committed in the name of independence, which strictly, puts Zeon, on the it makes them out to be the bad guys. Here we have our title card, Episode 1, Gundam Rising. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but, there's an argument to be made that despite being the protagonist, Amuro is not necessarily the main character of the story. But that's foreshadowing for a later subject. Let's continue. All right, so here we go. We're a couple minutes in, and we are being introduced to our protagonist, Amuro, for the first time. We see that he's obviously a very technically proficient person. He's got electronics all over his room. He's looking at a microscope, working on something. So, we're supposed to kind of infer some things about his personality. So here we're learning a lot about Amuro's character. Is he's kind of oblivious to what's going on in the outside world. There's an evacuation order going on, and he is cooped up in his room, rewiring a computer in his underwear. This tells us a lot about his character and the fact that, you would think that most people would be concerned about the fact that half the population had been wiped out by this ongoing war, this conflict. But he almost seems so far removed from it that it's really kind of frightening. Okay, so here we finally learn Frabo's name, and we are introduced to Hayato Kobayashi, who is Amuro's closest neighbor, and we get a little bit of insight into the relationship that Frau and Hayato have with Amuro. They consider him kind of this military brat, and they hold him kind of partially responsible for what's going on in their home colony. So here we have another difference between the subtitled translation and the dubbed translation. In the subbed version, Frabo tells Amuro that it's bad manners to eat and drive. In the dubbed version, Frabo says, Amuro, you're a hopeless case. So in the dubbed version, there's a little bit of ambiguity about what exactly Frabo is talking about. But in the subtitled translation, obviously, she's a lot more direct in what she's telling Amuro is the problem. In both translations, however, we get the sense that Fraubo is sort of a motherly figure to Amuro. She's a bit of a nag at times, but ultimately she is trying to hold Amuro to a higher standard than he holds himself, and that's going to be a very important character trait about Amuro going forward. So here we get another indication about how disconnected Amuro is, not only from the war effort, but also from his own family. Fraubo asks if Amuro's father is on the warship that's docking today, and he says, I think so. He said he was going Earthside about a week ago. It seems very disconnected and very kind of distant to say, like, oh, I don't even know where my father is. He went to Earth. So again, Amuro's sort of aloofness is being shown here. Now here we have the first mention of the titular mobile suit, the Gundam. Get the Gundam components loaded onto White Base. We still don't see what the Gundam looks like yet, and again, this is one of those things where if you ignore the opening credits, where, you know, the Gundam is featured pretty heavily, and you see what it looks like, you see Amuro, you see White Base, and all these things, you know, there's really no indication so far what we're about to see. So it's kind of this ambiguous thing that that they're talking about here, which I think is really cool. All right, so we have a neat exchange here between Temray, Amuro's father, and Bright Noah. Bright Noah will become a more prominent figure as the story goes on, but Temray makes the comment that once they mass produce the Gundam, that they might be able to win the war without sending kids like Bright into battle. The irony here is that once the Gundam is completed, it's Temray's own son, who is younger than Bright, that is going to be sent to the front lines to fight. Alright, so now we have a lot of plot points already set up for us. We have the fact that Amuro Ray's father, Lieutenant Temray, is a prominent figure in the Federation. He is aboard this experimental vessel, the White Base, and that they have been chased to this colony by a Zeon warship. We've also learned a little bit about Amuro's friends and relationships on the colony, and we'll see where we go from here. So here we are introduced to our main series antagonist, Char Aznable. He comments that he's unlucky to have run into a prize like the White Base on his way home from a mission, but there's no comment made about what mission he was on to begin with. Now, in this brief exchange between Char and his subordinate Dren, we learn some interesting things about his character, and there's a little bit of foreshadowing that's going on. You see, Dren is skeptical that the Federation has been able to develop mobile suits, whereas Char not only assumes that the Federation has developed mobile suits, but also predicted where they were made. And so once we get into the later parts of the story, again, you know, getting way ahead of ourselves, already we are seeing the inklings of Char having these types of supernatural premonitions that aid him in battle, and they have served him well in his military career, but we're going to see how those are maybe tied into the new type phenomenon that's covered later in the series. So here we get an example of some third-party character building, which is something that we've seen a little bit of so far, and we're going to see a lot of it in Gundam, where the character of Jean is actually revealing some things about Char Aznable by commenting about how he built his career on combat. So there's this sort of trend where one character will be talking to another about a third party, and the conversation between the characters that are speaking actually is building up the character and the mythology of the third party. It's a very strange way of informing the audience about a character's backstory, as opposed to just getting that information directly from the character, or, you know, at least from a first-person interaction between that character and another. But just an interesting thing to keep an eye out for. Alright, so once Jean's attack on the colony begins, we cut to the civilians of Side 7 inside what appears to be sort of a fallout shelter, and Amuro, hearing the explosions outside, says that he's going to go find his father and hopefully get help for everyone. And this one man speaks up and says, hey, going outside could put us all in danger. I want you to remember this moment because it's going to become very important here shortly. Alright, I want to take a moment to draw your guys' attention to this animation technique that's being used here. Because this was a children's cartoon made in 1979 on a very restrictive budget, you'll get a lot of these throughout the series, where when they want to convey an intense emotion such as fear or anxiety, we get this very close shot of a character's face, and we get just ever so slight trembles, whether it's in the eyes or maybe a bead of sweat coming down the brow. And even though this was done as a way of reducing frames that they had to animate, I find that it offers this really nuanced approach to conveying character emotion. I really like it. And I think that it's a lot more powerful than most modern anime. You're going to see these really dramatic, like, no! And like this big zoom out happens, and, maybe there's fire and stuff going on. And it's like, that type of over emoting really appeals to what I would consider like a low attention span audience. And let's face it, most of the anime fans that are watching these shows and a lot of the criticisms that are levied against older anime like this, they're coming from people that, let's face it, are watching the show while they're doing this. And they maybe have 3 tabs open on their computers, and they're really not paying attention the way that in the context of 1979, imagine you're this kid in Japan and, you're on a TV about this big and you're hyper focused on this show. These are those types of moments that if you blink, you miss it. And if you miss it, then you're really missing out on what I think is a powerful part of this original anime. This here is just a really cool scene that conveys the scale of what we're dealing with here. Obviously the characters themselves in their frightened response, and they look up at this Zeon Zaku, it's you can tell that it's a giant robot. But when you see those shell casings drop and they are larger than Amuro himself as he's running away, it very much puts this scale in perspective where, it's a terrifying thing that's happening here. Again, we are treated to one of these still animation sequences where, we see the horror on Amuro's face. And, a lot of these sequences are almost treated like, still image vignettes where they hold on a keyframe for a very long time. Maybe they pan a little bit or they zoom a little bit, but it's very much treated more like a book than a TV show. Now, here we are introduced to our first plot contrivance. This would be something that I would criticize, because here we have the instruction manual to the Gundam, and Amuro just happens to stumble upon it. And despite the fact that there was a massive explosion nearby that destroyed 2 cars, somehow this little paper binder survives completely intact. So here we have Amuro finally caught up to his father, and there's this brief interaction where he says, hey, our mobile suit's more important to you than human beings, which is kind of an inflammatory allegation to make against his father, considering that, only moments ago we had him interacting with Bright and saying, that the only reason he's doing all of this is in order to keep young kids off the battlefield. But, there's a bit of projection going on here as well, because, only moments ago, Amuro was holed up in his room, not really paying attention to what was going on. So there's this interesting sort of character trait that both Temray and Amuro Ray have, where they are so caught up in their own motivations and they're so caught up, distracted by these object material things, that sometimes they forget about the human element that's going on outside. Okay, so do you remember the man in the fallout shelter telling Amuro that he was putting them all in danger? Here we see countless civilians dead as a result of Amuro clearing them out of the shelter, and maybe they wouldn't have been safe in there either, but now we'll definitely never know. Again, this is characteristic of both Amuro and his father, who both have admirable motives at times. They're really just trying to do what they think is right, but their decisions often cost other people their lives. Again, we have one of those close shots on Fraubo capturing her sort of horror at the situation. So here we get this really sad moment where Fraubo realizes that her mother was caught in the explosion and killed. So again, if we reference this moment back to the Joseph Campbell hero circle, or the hero's journey, if that moment where Fraubo's mother was killed is Amuro's inciting incident, this would be him sort of answering the call to adventure. So I really like this little sequence where Amuro is starting up the Gundam for the first time. He's turning a key, he's switching a knob, he's pushing a button, he pulls a little lever in order to bring down the monitors in front of him. And, because a lot of people may accuse Amuro of being this sort of Mary Sue type character where he gets in the Gundam and just all of a sudden tears everyone apart. And it's really not like that. Amuro very much does not know what he's doing the first time he is in the Gundam, and we see that sort of build up in this short sequence here. So here we have a bit of dramatic irony, which is where the audience knows something that the characters in the story do not. And in this particular case, it's that Amuro is the pilot of the Gundam, Temray is looking at the Gundam and doesn't realize that it's his own son in there. Now, this is a pretty mild example of it, but you'll find that dramatic irony is a literary technique that is used pretty heavily throughout the entire Gundam franchise. So here we have this little line from Gene where he says it's like the mobile suit is shaking in terror, and it is. You know, Amuro is scared. This is his first time in a mobile suit. He doesn't know what he's doing. But juxtapose that with Gene's appearance. His pupils are super dilated. He's pouring sweat. He just realized that his Zaku rifle is not dealing any damage to the Gundam. So it's almost like he's projecting his own fear and his own insecurity onto the Gundam, and he's kind of hyping himself up. It's this really nuanced moment that if you blink, you miss it. So here's that iconic moment where Amuro grabs the face of the Zaku and throws it back, tearing the front pipe off of it. And not only in this moment do we witness just how much more powerful the Gundam is than the Zaku's, but it's almost like a comic book panel, the way it's illustrated, and there's no motion going on. It's just a little pan and zoom on the Gundam holding this Zaku part. So here we have the moment when the Gundam first pulls out its beam saber and it leaps through the air. This has been captured in tons of different artwork and Gunpla dioramas. This is such an important moment in sort of Gundam history, the moment that Amuro first dispatches a Zaku and he cuts it in half. Now, where I think that this moment falls flat is that we're not shown in the story so far that beam sabers are a new technology at this point in the history of the show. And so for these Zaku pilots, this would be the equivalent of the first time that someone ever saw a gunpowder weapon being deployed on the battlefield. And so for the audience, it looks cool, but the audience is denied the narrative weight of what's really happening here. And again, given what just happened, blowing a hole in the side of the colony, here we have another one of these close-up moments where Amuro is realizing that if he's not careful about how he dispatches these Zakus, he might cause more carnage and mayhem than he is preventing by intervening in this attack. Again, this goes back to that moment when the civilian in the fallout shelter said, "You might be putting us in more danger." Here we have another one of those iconic still frames, and as I keep saying, even though this was done as a way to save money on animation, reduce the number of keyframes, and speed up production, these moments tend to stick with you more than if it was animated at full speed. And it's a lot like pop music, you know, how they repeat the refrain enough times that it becomes an earworm, that it sticks with you for a long time. And if you compare this to some more modern shows, you'd be hard-pressed to find moments like these where you can pick out a single frame of the animation and say, like, that's the shot, that was awesome, you know? So we close out the episode with this sort of cryptic line from Char Aznable, where he says, "No one likes to admit to them the mistakes that they've made because of their youth." And this is another one of those moments where there's a difference between the subbed version and the dubbed version, because in the dub, they add an additional line where he says, "I guess I have no choice," which kind of changes the context of what's going on here, because in the subtitled version, it's really left ambiguous as to who he's talking about admitting to their mistakes because of their youth. Whereas in the dubbed version, it is very explicit that he's talking about himself, that he doesn't want to admit to the mistakes that he's made because of his youth. But, you know, I think that in the subtitled version, there's almost this suggestion that maybe this was Gene's fault as a result of him attacking without clearance to do so. But, you know, this is one of those moments where maybe the interpretation can be a little more fluid. So that's it for episode 1. We get a preview of what's to come in episode 2 at the end, and it appears to be a very Char-heavy episode. Even though the first episode was largely an introduction to the characters and the world of Gundam, I think that there are some interesting things happening in the narrative, with Amuro heeding the call to adventure while still showing his fallibility and quirks in his character that are going to crop up later. Additionally, we learn a lot about our main antagonist, Char, and again, it's very telling that the episode closes on him rather than on Amuro. I hope you guys like this super pedantic look at the first episode of Mobile Suit Gundam. If there's anything you think I missed, let me know in the comments down below. Subscribe so you don't miss episode 2. And until then, thank you guys so much for watching. I will catch you later.
Well, was mauled by a cougar, learned nothing about driving, and my Crystal Gale shirt was ruined.